Thank you. Good morning to our friends on the West Coast and good afternoon to our guests in the Midwest and the East Coast. I want to welcome everybody to day two of the AURP virtual BioHealth Caucus 2020. I want to also thank, my name is Mark Romney. I'm the Director of Research Development Industry Alliances for UC Davis Health, as well as the Chief Strategy Officer for Aggie Square, which is our new innovation district. I'm also have the privilege of being on the board of directors with AURP. And next slide. Thanks. And I want to express a great level of gratitude to our sponsors for AURP. As you know, AURP is a nonprofit and relies on our members and our sponsors to sustain. I want to recognize Tech Parks Arizona, Wexford Science and Technology, University Financing Foundation, Whiting Turner, Collaborative Real Estate, Sterling Bay, and our special sponsors for this BioHealth Caucus is CIFA, which is the Scientific Equipment and Furniture Association, as well as EAGB, which is the Economic Alliance of Greater Baltimore. I also want to extend a big thank you to my co-chair, Rich Bendis, with BioHealth Innovation. And we have a great group on the panel that I'm moderating for you today. We've got a really exciting group. Next slide. The topic of our panelists, I've got four guests with us today, is about funding during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. So the National Institutes of Health, known as NIH, is a very important, sometimes overlooked partner for research parks and their client life science companies. Our next speaker, Steve Ferguson, from the NIH Office of Technology Transfer, will show you how working with the NIH can be a significant asset for life sciences, or for life science companies at any stage of their development. Besides his 30-year role in tech transfer, Steve also serves as the department chair at the NIH Graduate School and a reviewer for several company funding programs in Maryland, Virginia, and for the Department of Defense. It's my honor to introduce Steve on his topic. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be part of this program today, and I thought I'd like to give you a little bit of a taste about for AURP companies that are working in these parks, how they can really work well with NIH and really do business with the National Institutes of Health. So next slide, please. So why would you want to think about doing business? With this budget of $4.7 billion, it doesn't quite buy as much as it used to, but a very important part of funding for research programs, both intramurally at the NIH laboratories and more importantly, extramurally at companies and universities. Our internal program is quite large, 6,000 scientists, over 2,000 individual research projects working on basic and clinical research, and collaborations with industry and academia, like the clients in your parks, are very important because of these partners that commercialize things into products. So without products being commercialized, we aren't really able to meet our goal as a healthcare institution. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through some of your top 6 reasons for doing business. I think there's to be something here for everyone. Some you may be familiar with, others not. I'm going to talk to you about in-licensing NIH technology, research collaborations with our laboratories, primarily in Bethesda, Maryland, but located in other locations throughout the United States as well. I'm also going to mention using some of the preclinical and clinical research services that are open to outside parties. I'm also going to mention selling products and services to NIH, getting grants and contracts, which probably most people are more familiar with, and maybe what people aren't familiar with, using some NIH information services to improve your business and help build your company. So what are some of the myths that people may have about working with NIH? You know, it is part of the government, but one of the issues that people may think about is that we're only doing basic research, but here you can see the picture of our clinical center that in fact we work very commonly and very closely on translational and clinical partnerships as part of this process. Another myth is only working on drugs, but a very active program of some of our institutes on devices, diagnostics, biomarkers, other types of aspects. We're probably most famous for 3 in terms of we're working a lot with academics, funding a lot of academic research, but we have literally 1,800 license agreements in effect right now with companies, and funding is also provided to industry partners. Most companies are eligible for most funding opportunities. Another myth is that we only work on our own ideas. Well, that's certainly, we do have a number of good ideas to work on and can license them out, but a lot of the projects work externally with your idea because often we're trying to find the solution to an important healthcare problem. And the example of COVID-19 is actually quite interesting because most of those solutions, are coming from external sources. The other issue is that we only work with US companies. That's not true. A very substantial part of our portfolio is licenses and collaborations with international companies. And again, looking at the example of COVID-19 and the examples of some of the international aspects that NIH is working on there as well. Next slide, please. So what are some of the advantages? Well, you have some access to unique reagents and resources. You don't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of laboratory materials. We do have a lot of scientific and regulatory expertise. Our FDA is our sister agency. We're the world's largest holders of IND, for example, the National Cancer Institutes. Also, in terms of working with license agreements, we do have compelling business terms. There's no front equity. We're not taking an equity position in your company. And the collaborations that we do often will lead to new IP. And then new IP and the collaborations have features of low overhead rates, exclusive options to the IP created during this process, and reasonable milestones and in terms of payments and royalties due. So again, very attractive terms for collaborations. So what might be some useful links for AURP company to think about? Well, the first one is talking about if you're a startup, some of the aspects of being a biotech startup and partnering with NIH includes some of the things we've talked about. More general business opportunities is in the second box. You can think about contracting opportunities, service opportunities, other types of opportunities related to sort of business transactions. We have a database that you can search licensing opportunities. That's the one I'm perhaps most familiar with through the program. And our institute, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, has a number of specialized COVID-19 programs at NIAID, both funding and collaboration opportunities that are available as well. So it's just to conclude that don't forget your Uncle Sam, and he wants to work with you in terms of active collaborations, license agreements, and general business terms. We need to work very closely with biotech companies, early stage, late stage, larger companies, and we hope that can be you, and hopefully you'll be back in contact with us about it. Thanks.
Stephen, thank you very much. That was outstanding. I see a few questions coming in, and what I'll do is at the end, we'll have sort of a Q&A session with all four panelists. But thank you again for a great presentation.
That would be great. Look forward to it.
Thank you. Okay, next up, we've got Paul Szalinski, who's the Executive Director of the Federal Laboratory Consortium for Technology Transfer, or FLC, where he leads support more than 300 federal agencies, laboratories, and research centers to accomplish their joint mission to foster commercialization best practices and accelerate federal technologies out of the labs and into the marketplace. Prior to his role, Paul served for more than 30 years as a federal manager, engineer, and scientist. Most recently, Paul served as the Director of Technology Partnerships at the office at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Paul also worked at federal agencies in development and deployment of technology, including the EPA, Department of Energy. He's also served as active duty and commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, including duty in Korea, Panama, Germany, and the United States. Paul earned his master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Maryland, a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Toledo, and an MBA with specialization in entrepreneurship from North Central University. So it's my honor to introduce Paul, I apologize, and look forward to your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Honored to be here today. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share with all of you some of the information about the Federal Lab Consortium. So let's go ahead to the next slide, please. So what I want to really do is open up the aperture a little bit from what Steve was talking about, really. So the NIH, of course, is a premier health agency within the federal government. But really, if you look across the entire federal government, we actually have over 300 federal laboratories that span 14 different agencies. And some of those aren't always what you think they are going to be. And that's really what the FLC is about, is how do you get these same opportunities, for example, that Steve was talking about, and working with other agencies across the government. We have a great network opportunity for you. Basically, we know someone that knows something. If you come to us, it's actually a great way to try to figure out who's doing some work in some of these different areas. And our goal really is to connect you with some of the opportunities that are available in this field from across the federal government and across all the different agencies. If we can move to the next slide, please. So really, what do? Well, we spend about $150 billion annually in federal research across all these different agencies. And like I said, one of the interesting things is, we do kind of everything, if you will. We certainly do COVID research, and NIH is a premier organization for that, as well as across the Department of Health and Human Services. So as you know, CDC, FDA, some of those are very familiar. What you might not think about right off the top of your head are things like the Department of Defense has a tremendous healthcare system. They do a lot of health-related research. Interesting enough, one of the products that we've licensed out was actually from the Department of Energy in healthcare that came from a fossil energy lab that actually ended up in a heart stent, for example. So it's not always where the person that you might think is the most obvious that's doing the research that might be of the most benefit. When I was at NIST, for example, I used to talk a lot about measurement science. Don't do exactly research in biologic fields, but we can measure things extremely well at NIST. And so, for example, that might be the thing that you need for your business, or for the specific opportunity, rather than sort of the general opportunity. And that's really what the FLC is about, is this networking opportunity to really figure out what's going on across the entire government complex. And we're certainly super happy to have Steve and the folks at NIH as part of that. But again, this involves all these different agencies and pretty much anything you can think of. And let's move to the next slide, please. So as Steve already mentioned, there's some of the common mechanisms that we do. We do a lot of partnership agreements. We do many different partnerships agreements each year. We have thousands, to be honest with you. We do certainly invent things, and we do license those opportunities out. And there's many different opportunities that you can find of things that we've invented. You don't have to come with your own. You can certainly try to find something that we've already got out there. We've got unique facilities, and we've got unique equipment actually at these federal laboratories that often are available for your use. Most of the time, many of them can be available at little to no cost. Honestly, most of the federal agencies, they'll have to break even. So there's no ability to make a profit. They're not allowed to compete with the private sector. That's not how these things work. They're generally available as a user facility, kind of at the cost, if you will, in order to recoup costs, sometimes even less. Depends what you get, and depends the agreement that you negotiate. Like I said, many different ways to partner. It doesn't always have to be a formal agreement. We do many informal types of partnerships. We actually can provide just technical expertise by just trying to get a hold of somebody on the phone. And maybe that's all it takes, is just a few minutes to try to find somebody who's a specialist that can answer a few questions. All these different things are available. And like I said, we have a great networking opportunity to try to bring all these different services to you. So if we can move on. So how do you find these different types of opportunities? Well, that's actually where our website comes in. Of course, I can point you back there. But like I said, we have a great network that sits behind it. Actually, there's some more stuff if we want to pull that up. But we actually have a mechanism database. Basically, you can look at what kind of mechanisms are available from different agencies. We have the ability to search across the agencies for available intellectual property. We actually have a locator service. You basically call us. We'll try to help you try to figure out what it is you're looking for. We do best practices across agencies to try to basically look at, everybody operates a little bit independently, but there's a lot of similar tools. Probably one of the better things, we also have the ability to search across across laboratories and facilities. And actually that's one of these nice things where it's like, well, who's working on something, or where are these things located? There's a map. You can figure out what labs are in the different areas and what kind of things they work on, or maybe even just search across keywords and look for facilities or specialized equipment in some different areas. The other day I was just answering a question about, for example, test beds. Where do I find one? Well, you can try to search it across this site. It's actually one of the best opportunities to actually look across all of the different agencies. I mean, obviously you can put it into a general search engine, but this actually is more targeted at what we have available from our federal laboratories. So if we move on. So of course, the question that was really put out is, where do I find federal funding opportunities in many respects? And so Steve talked about those really specifically for NIH. And I just want to throw out there, in general government terms, When we talk about some of these tech transfer things, those aren't necessarily money out. When you think about money out from the federal government, where do I get federal funds to do work? You actually want to look at these sites. So if you're looking at something that's going to be, there's grants, all of them are up on grants.gov. We all use the same site, all the different agencies. And these are funding opportunities basically where you're going to do work for the benefit of others. If you go to this Beta SAM site, for example, that's where all of the contracts are advertised. Well, what's a contract? Contracts are when the government is advertising to do something that they're going to buy. So if you want to sell something to the government, this is where you're going to find it. If you're going to deliver a specific product or service to the government, this is where you're going to find those different types of opportunities. Challenge.gov is kind of an interesting thing. So if you're up for a challenge, these are basically where you see things. Most people think about things like, the space type of opportunities, but there's all sorts of challenges. This really broadened out in 2016 with some new authorities, and so you'll see challenges in all sorts of different areas. Now, the interesting thing with challenge, of course, is that you put your money up front to compete. Only the winners actually get paid out. So it is one of those things that has a little bit of a risk with it, as opposed to some of those other areas where they're advertising the opportunity, you put in your proposal, and of course, you're selected for an award or a contract, or you're not. If you're a small business and you're not familiar with SBIR, I highly recommend you check out this program. There's a direct link basically to the SBA, the Small Business Administration website with sbir.gov. All of the solicitations, now you can find them in grants and you can find them on the SAM website, but they're all just listed here. SBIR is a set aside for small businesses to do specific work, and it is basically non-diluted funding that you can get to help you do some research towards starting up your company. And again, if you're a company that's not familiar with SBIR, please, please, please check out this site. It is to your great benefit. So let's keep going. So again, talking about COVID-19 on the Federal Lab Consortium webpage, we actually put up a nice COVID-19 site. So we actually talk about all the different activities. We collect all the news stories and actually put them in one place. Here's what's going on with some of the different tech transfer types of opportunities and the different stories that are coming out across all the different agencies. We consolidate them here. We have some other information as it becomes available, and we just basically place it all up on this site. I would invite you to check this out to see a couple different things. One, like I said, we have some unique things about mass testing, for example. But there's also, you can look through some of the different stories here and kind of get some ideas of what people are working on, what some of the expertise is, and it's a nice little place to find some of these different stories. You can just sort of scan right through. You can see the little logos there and figure out who's doing work, maybe if they're close by or not, if you don't care about that, and how you might work with these different agencies and something that really is of interest to you. At the end of the day, if we can move on to the next slide, we really want to connect with you. If you think about federal research, as I said, we spend $150 billion annually in research and development. We don't actually make products. We're not your competitors in a business. We're actually someone that can be a force multiplier. We can help. Our goal is actually to work with you because we need a company that's going to bring these technologies to life. If someone's going to buy a product, and that includes us, even if the government's going to buy a product, someone has to make it, someone has to distribute it, someone has to sell it. And we buy those things. We don't make those things in general. And so we really need to work with companies, and that is our goal. We want to work with you, and I hope to see you in the future. Please check us out on all our different, see our different social media tracks here, and certainly our website. And thank you very much for your time. And I understand we'll take questions at the end.
Paul, thank you so much. What a great presentation. And again, for the guests that are enjoying this presentation, be sure to upload any questions to the Q&A box on the webinar. So that's fantastic. So our next speaker is Steve Susolka, and Steve is the Chief Executive Officer for AUTM, the Association of University Technology Managers, a global nonprofit whose members work to advance research from academic labs to the marketplace. He's a registered U.S. patent agent and a past board member of multiple Wake Forest affiliated startups, many of which grew up in the University Research Parks. Steve earned his doctorate in neuroscience from the University of Virginia. Steve, welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
All right, thank you, Mark. And thank you for the opportunity to present. As many on the line know, the university research parks are a critical element of the innovation ecosystem. And you have worked very closely with AUTM members around the country and the world. So I know this session is focused on both funding opportunities and resources, and really what I'd like to focus on and what I'd like to spend my time on is focusing on those resources and partnerships that you can build with our university members. So a step back for those of you that might not know much about Autumn. We are a nonprofit leader in educating, promoting, and inspiring tech transfer professionals that are changing the world and driving innovation forward. Our members are composed of about 3,000 different members from about 800 different universities, research institutes, hospitals, government labs, and industry. And our members work very closely with commercial partners like the Tannins in your parks to transform those ideas that are developed on their campuses and in their labs into new products that actually total thousands of new products and thousands of startup companies and millions in economic development every year. If we can go to the next slide. So since the early 90s, we have actually been tracking data on the importance of research funded generally by the federal government that arises out of universities, hospitals, and government labs. And here you can kind of just see a quick life cycle. You're probably familiar with that. What I wanted to highlight here, though, is I wanted to highlight the intersection between what Autumn members are doing and your tenant companies. So as you can see, university research has led to thousands of startup companies. We had over 1,000 last year alone. And many of those startup companies are existing in your individual research parks. In addition, there's a lot of research that's going on at those universities where they're looking for third parties to help advance certain inventions. So as those inventions are developed on campuses, there is a need to de-risk those technologies and get them to a place where they can be out-licensed. Now, that licensee might be a tenant in your park. It might be an existing company. But they're always looking for resources, whether that's on the measurement, on the prototyping scale, and oftentimes those are companies that can be found in these research parks around the country and world. If we could go to the next slide here. Now, people think about technology transfer, and sometimes they think perhaps that just means patent licensing, and nothing could be farther from the truth. Technology transfer has really expanded and is now really focused on economic development, which again, that perfect overlap between university technology transfer and those university research parks is clearly evident. In fact, we've been tracking data and been releasing biennial reports on this. And so in our last report that's released with Autumn and Bio, what we found was over a 22-year period, technology transfer has led to up to $591 billion in GDP and up to 4.3 million jobs supported. Again, many of them reside in your own research parks. If we can go to the next slide, please. So universities work on a wide breadth of different types of research, but I will tell you that we are laser focused right now on addressing the pandemic. And it is working at a speed that I have never seen before. And I've never been prouder to be part of this community. So the reason I mention this is I know many of your tenants are in all different fields, but those that are related to COVID, you would be astounded at how quickly inventions are advanced on the university setting. So I'll give you an example. The University of Nebraska Medical Center was looking to create a new intubation shield. So when a doctor is intubating a patient, didn't want to be exposed to the virus, and were interested in getting some new intubation shields. They partnered with a specialty plastics company, and get this, within 48 hours of that arrangement being set, they had developed product that was being sold to both coasts And in fact, by 6 hours after they went live with this, they were receiving orders from across the country. So this is a great opportunity for your very specialized to be reaching cities across the country and world to identify can their resources be used to address COVID. If we can go to the next slide, please. In order to allow us to track all the amazing developments, and when I say amazing developments, you will see a ton of inventions, whether they're new vaccine candidates, diagnostics, PPEs, and they're arising from universities. And so what we did was we put together a website. It can be found on our website, autumn.net/COVID. And there you could see some of the ongoing research. We highlight this on a daily basis. And we also, for those of you that might be interested, have actually released some licensing guidelines to help our members and their institutions license COVID-like technology or COVID addressing technologies during the period of this pandemic in order to get those out as fast as possible. If we can go to the next slide. Now, I know I've been talking about COVID specific technologies, but I do want to mention that, again, we have just a wide breadth of technologies that are available to support your companies. So another really, really important website for you to check out is our Autumn Innovation Marketplace, or AIM site. And so there you can see the address. There we have, and circled at the bottom, over 21,000 technologies that run the gamut from photovoltaics to cancer diagnostics to artificial intelligence inventions. This is a wonderful site for two main reasons. Number one, companies in your parks might find technologies they might be interested in licensing that might add to the developments they're putting together. But secondly, and almost just as important, if not more important, this is an opportunity for your companies to identify the types of research that is being pursued. And so you're going to learn a lot by finding out, the school that you're closest to. Type in that institution into our search bar, and you'll find all those technologies. What that's going to show you is, are there resources that your company might, your tenant company might be interested in providing to the institution to further that development? Again, back to the de-risking of technologies. Or secondly, are there resources that exist on campus that might be very beneficial to your company? So, whether it's a multi-million-dollar electron microscope, access to clean rooms, there's a whole host of resources that are available in the university setting. If we could go to the final slide. So as Paul mentioned, and Steve mentioned before, this is an area where it is a people profession. And so it's really important to stay connected. And so I really hope that you reach out to us. And should you find technologies of interest, we'll provide you with the direct licensing contact through the AIM database. You don't even need to come to us for that. But if there's anything we can do to help your research park or your individual tenants move forward in the innovation ecosystem, that's exactly why we're here. That's why we're formed, and we're here to help. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Steve. What a great presentation. I really appreciate the comprehensive information. I'm sure there will be more questions that come in towards the end for you. Next slide. So next, I have the pleasure of introducing Christian Bramer. So Christian is the CEO and founder of Benefunder. It's a platform that connects the philanthropists with leading researchers and entrepreneurs across life science, tech, environment, education sectors to help bring new innovations to market. Benefunder has over 700 leading researchers under contract and profiled on their platform, which integrates with the major wealth management platforms and the family office networks to provide a solution for rising client demand for impact. Prior to becoming an entrepreneur, Christian began his career as a financial advisor with Morgan Stanley and later with Merrill Lynch. In 2006, he founded Joe Media, the first national free Wi-Fi network, which was later acquired by our leading digital out-home media company. Throughout his career, he has always volunteered with various nonprofits in both a board and executive capacity. Christian currently serves as an entrepreneur in residence with Connect and is a past speaker at TEDMed and MIT Enterprise Forum. So Christian completed his military service as a sergeant section commander in the 1st Light Infantry Division in the Royal Danish Army, where he was also elected vice national spokesman for the enlisted personnel. He has a degree in international business from Copenhagen Business School. Again, it's my honor to introduce Christian, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thanks for having me here today, and thank you for Brian for the invitation. I just wanted to start off before I go into the slides with a little bit of the founding story behind Benefunder, which I thought would put everything kind of into context. So about 5 years ago, my 4-year-old nephew at the time went through a case of a rare liver cancer, which really kind of threw our whole family for a loop, as these things do. Fortunately for us, after a year of treatment, he was now cancer-free, and the family was thinking about how to pay it forward. And it was in that exercise that I realized, how difficult, time-consuming, and expensive it was for a funder to fund research effectively. So that was a problem that we decided to jump into. And essentially what we realized was that, the efficiency of a dollar going from a funder's hands into the hands of a researcher was really diluted quite significantly along those stages. And so we thought, this problem has been solved before in other industries, and why don't we see if we can apply some of those learnings to research funding. So where we started off with in our evolution was a philanthropic services platform as a nonprofit that would connect researchers directly with funders. And the idea was to integrate this into a wealth management platform like the ones I used to work for at Merrill Lynch and Morgan Stanley. So what we quickly learned was that the wealth management industry was a very difficult industry to get into, and so was the university side. Academic research was not something that you can just walk in the door with an idea and expect to get traction. So we figured that out, and about a year and a half later, we made our first pivot into what we call Benefunder 2.0, where we ironically converted from a nonprofit to a for-profit, started to integrate with existing philanthropic funds like donor advised funds and other groups like that, and still working on a channel opportunity, distribution opportunity within wealth management. In that phase, we started to get traction. We started to fund our first, researchers. We got on the UBS Philanthropic Services platform, and things were going well. But we started to see that we were getting more traction from, directly from family offices and private foundations. And so we started to shift into a more direct opportunity, which alludes to Benefunder 3.0, which is I'm going to talk about today. In that process, also, we realized that, a lot of the families love to have the opportunity to fund innovation at the bench, but they were really interested in getting these opportunities to market. And so we realized that at some point we'd have to figure out a way to facilitate, more investment-driven funding. So where we are today, Benefunder 3.0, is we are both a philanthropic services platform as well as a capital markets platform, which means we operate as a broker-dealer, a registered broker-dealer to facilitate, direct investments into early-stage companies. So next slide. So this is probably a very common slide that all of you are very familiar with. There are certain aspects of research that are, and particularly commercialization, that are very difficult to find capital for, particularly in what is affectionately known as the Valley of Death, where we're talking about above market rate risk, maybe below market rate returns, but still, a significant social impact and a need to further some of these opportunities. Next slide. So as I alluded to in our model, we have both philanthropic services and a securities component, which means that we're able to facilitate funding along a continuum of capital. So that continuum really starts at the very earliest stages in restricted gift funding for research, That then transitions as things are further developed into grant funding, and there are lots of different forms of grant funding. There can be traditional grants, recoverable grants, convertible grants, things like that. And as you continue further down the continuum, you start getting into commercialization, where you're talking about pre-seed and seed funding. Sometimes with our clients, that would come from a foundation or a more philanthropic or impact-driven source of capital, which is both more risk tolerant and more patient. And then as we continue to move down the risk curve, so to speak, we start to tap into more traditional sources of capital from private funders. And in our case, our clients are the funder. We work with private foundations as well as the family offices, and help them kind of create a continuum of capital across the thematic areas that they feel most passionate about. Next slide. So in order to do this, we've created basically an ecosystem that acts as an agent on behalf of the funder to basically turbocharge, the areas of interest they've already identified. And so in that ecosystem, starting from left to right, of course, we have researchers and entrepreneurs, and we have philanthropists and investors on the right. But really, to pull this off, the partners that we work with are research institutions. So these would be large, universities. Right now, we're partnered with Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Wisconsin, Florida, a number of large institutions like that. We have about a dozen of those. And if you look at the bottom, accelerators and incubators, they play an incredibly important role for us, not only for us to introduce the researchers that we work with that have an entrepreneurial interest, but also to source opportunities that have gone through a process and that have been vetted that we can match back to our funder mandates. We also work with donor advised fund administrators. If you're not familiar with what these are, there's about 110 billion in assets that are philanthropic, that are in separately managed accounts. These would be with groups like Fidelity Charitable, which is the largest in the country. You've also got a series of community foundations. Every major city has one. And these are a series of separately managed accounts where tax deductions have been taken, and there's a philanthropic interest to deploy these assets. And then at the bottom, you'll see wealth management. This is where we work with large and small wealth management firms as a specialist to help their private banking clients that have identified an area of interest where they'd like to deploy capital according to their cause areas. Next slide. So the way we do this today, it's very much hand cranked, but where we're going with it as a company is to build a full technology platform that facilitates from start to finish a broad-based search of available funding opportunities on behalf of our clients. Content management systems so that we can easily facilitate, whether it be a gift, a grant, or an investment to delineate, what those use of funds look like, what stage the company's in, what source of funding, outside funding sources those opportunities might have as a point of validation. CRM systems so that we can continually, communicate back and forth with our constituents and stakeholders. Eventually, we're going to be incorporating AI into this so that we can automatically do these matches and create portfolios. And then lastly, to expand, beyond the white glove service with the ultra high net worth segment, we want to build APIs so that we can democratize this process and make it available to anybody with a checkbook and an impact agenda. Next slide. So this is a slide that kind of depicts our current mandates. And just as a little bit of background, I want to explain what this means. So when we work with a funder, we start with a deep dive needs assessment to understand, what problems they're trying to solve, how they're structured, how they like to deploy capital, whether it's investment or philanthropy or both, which is depicted as blended. And then we have two types of mandates. Basically, active are clients that have engaged us, in other words, hired us as an agent to go out and find these opportunities for them. And then others that are more passive, where they've simply shared what they're interested in. And there's a handshake agreement to say that if we find opportunities that match what they're doing, we will send it their way and they will consider funding them. So you see kind of a list of mandates here. We publish these primarily in the interest of putting these out to our strategic partners to help us find opportunities that match what we're looking for. And I also want to point out, in the theme of COVID-19, a lot of the mandates that we had as the pandemic was hitting kind of froze and wanted to wait to see what was going to happen in the world before they took any additional action. And so as that was happening, we started to get updates and inputs from our network of researchers and entrepreneurs, and we're really just taken aback by how quickly they were pivoting and stepping up to address the issue. And so we decided to put together a COVID-19 call series. It was a 3-part series that focused on vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics, expecting we might have 10 to 20 callers that would join us on a call or two. We were rather surprised to see that there was about 150 people that called in. About 50 of those represented family offices in the range of 100 million to 25 billion and up in assets. Really wanting to understand the landscape, wanted to see what was happening, getting introduced to new opportunities that were out there. And so we tried to feature a funder on each call, as well as a researcher and an entrepreneur. So there was really kind of a continuum of capital, as well as somebody who is currently engaged in funding in this area. And it really was an amazing outcome. I mean, we've already started to deploy our first couple rounds of capital into COVID-19, both in research. There's some transactions that are about to happen into early stage companies. But really what we're seeing is a lot of family offices are really leaning in and looking at this not from a return-driven capacity necessarily, but where they can fill gaps in the ecosystem. So really want to be transformational and help things get to market quicker and help them get to scale. So that's also a large area of interest that hasn't been updated on this slide yet, but one that we're interested in connecting with folks on that are currently working in. So next slide. So we're interested in speaking to all of you about how we can work together, how we can share our mandates, how we can more efficiently and effectively connect our funding mandates with promising opportunities across the spectrum. So if I invite anybody that is interested in having a follow-up conversation to contact me at the information on this slide.
Christian, thank you so much. What an impressive presentation, and I appreciate your passion and dedication to your company and all the great efforts you push forward. I'd like to invite all the panel members back. We've got a few questions that have come in, and I just want to I just want to make sure I get the time or take the time to pass these questions along. Do we got everybody on? All right, fantastic. So I'm going to start with Steve Ferguson. One came in that, are there perhaps some unusual or unexpected ways that companies can use NIH assets to further their growth or product development?
Yes, Mark, actually there are. I mean, everyone thinks of the traditional things such as SBIR or contracts or grants, and certainly that's a big part. But a number of other things would be to perhaps think about selling your products to NIH, particularly if you're in the research reagent business or lab equipment or instrumentation business. Attend and get a booth at our research festivals, the fall one on our Bethesda campus and our spring one at our Frederick campus. I guess we'll have to see how these develop post-COVID-19, but that would be a possibility. The other thing to think about is that if you're looking for members if you're a startup looking for members for a scientific advisory board, check some of the NIH databases. The reporter database shows scientists who receive funding from NIH. So you could check your area of interest and see who in the academic community or at companies has received funding in that area. And that would be perhaps generate a short list for future members of your SAB. So a couple different things to think about, not just necessarily about funding and contracts.
Thank you so much. I've got a question for both Steves. Come from Brian. So how important is the Bayh-Dole Act in preserving incentives for new technologies?
So you want to take that first? Or?
I'll take the, yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. And for those of you that don't know, the Bayh-Dole was absolutely instrumental for allowing the harnessing of federal funding to create products and services that are changing the world. So just as one example, prior to the Bayh-Dole Act back in 1980, there was not a single example of when the federal government funded an invention on a campus that turned into an actual therapeutic, which is unbelievable. Since then, there have been over 200 FDA-approved drugs that have come forward to that's come from the federal government and advanced by research. So I would say that the Bayh-Dole Act is absolutely instrumental in preserving those incentives to allow for the commercialization of those inventions that have turned into products that are saving lives and making the world a better place. Steve, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
I agree entirely. It really is all about incentives. So even for our own internal program, legislation similar to Bayh-Dole has put incentives into our program. So from our own programs, we've come up with 34 different drugs and vaccines that have come from our intramural research programs. And before these things, there wasn't really any incentive. If there was any royalties, it went to the general fund of the U.S. Treasury. No incentives for individual investigators and no incentives for programs. So the whole idea is, yes, we want to do good, but to help prime the pump a little bit with these types of activities is very important.
Thank you both very much. That was great. Next question, and this I just want to follow up, Christian. You mentioned the role of incubators and accelerators in your model. Can you expand on that a little bit and what your connection is with, or how you connect with the incubators and accelerators that are out there?
Yeah. So the a perfect example, is Sean O'Sullivan Ventures is a group that has about a dozen or so accelerator incubators across the country. They also have a funding mechanism for those organizations that come in, and they're an ideal partner for us because a lot of the researchers that come to us looking for just guidance and support in terms of how to get started in building their company and where to go for funding. For us, we don't really have the in-house capabilities to go in and do technical due diligence on these companies. We have every capability of doing the investment due diligence. And intentionally, some of these companies are very, very early, right? So we can give them guidance. And for us to be able to send someone like that to one of these programs to get that initial guidance, we know there are requirements for getting in, and we understand those requirements, and we can kind of convey those to the funders to say that, look, this is someone that passed the screening process, was accepted into this program. That means they have something that has some validity, right? And that's the first aspect of it. The second aspect of it is when we have a known funder mandate, which we share openly with our strategic partners, they're able to source opportunities for us to look at. And in the case of SOSV and a couple of others, they're also willing to put, someone who led the due diligence round, maybe it's a GP, that's willing to get on a call with, one of the investment officers at a family office to kind of take them through their process and why they feel strongly about this company. And that's a tremendous value add to our family offices, because it really filters out the noise for them quite a bit, and it gives them a sense of confidence that what we're putting in front of them is meets their mandate. And in some cases, we have mandates that say, we want access to the things that wouldn't otherwise get funded if it weren't for this impact agenda. We want to give them an opportunity to raise a little capital to go meet those milestones that are required to get into one of these organizations. So it's not a black or white answer necessarily. It's just an ability for us to provide some confidence or some kind of a pathway for the things that are being funded to get to market.
That's great. Thank you so much, Christian. Steve Salka, I've got a question for you. The universities are on the front line of COVID pandemic. Can you give some examples of university products that are, technology that's being advanced?
Sure. Yeah, and actually, probably the easier question to ask is what university technologies are not addressing that, or what COVID pandemic addressing technologies are not being developed at universities, because frankly, it is across the entire field. So let me just give a couple of examples. Some of the vaccine candidates that you're seeing today have arisen from universities across the United States and forward and overseas, Oxford University, Moderna, even Remdesivir. all were developments that actually grew out of institutions. So there, or academic institutions. So there you've got vaccine candidates, but it doesn't stop there. I mentioned the intubation shields. Was a great example of a development from University of Nebraska, but that's not the only one. Let's see, Michigan State has developed a N95 sterilization technique that's allowing for the reusing of N95 masks, which were in dire need a couple months ago and may continue. That's one example. Let's see, there are face shields that were developed at Columbia. That's actually a crazy story. So there, what happened was within 48 hours of creating the file that 3D printed these face shields, they were providing them to New York Presbyterian and hospitals around New York City. They ramped up to 1.5 million face shields. Absolutely remarkable. So it really runs the gamut, and it just gets back to this idea of universities are just laser focused in developing technologies that are addressing this pandemic right now. And again, it's a fantastic opportunity for startup companies that reside in research parks or providers of specialty equipment or solutions that reside in those parks to work with those universities. You will be astounded at the inventions being developed.
That's great. I mean, a follow-up I mentioned yesterday, but one of our startup company that's at UC Davis, partnered with the university, but they have this microarray patch that delivers vaccines. They were doing it for flu, but now pivoted to COVID-19 therapies, vaccine, and it can be self-administered by the patient. But it's just one of those revolutionary technologies that is great. So thank you so much. I've got a question for Paul. Do federal labs have a list of tech licenses or research facilities available, similar to what Steve mentioned with Autumn?
Sure, and that was what I mentioned about our website. If you go to federallabs.org, you can find actually a searchable database of all the IP that's available for licensing, and also a really nice search tool on federal facilities. So you can look at what the laboratories are, as well as some of the specific pieces of equipment that are available and that people might be able to use out there as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. And Christian, one came from, for those not familiar with DAF, my understanding is that the donor gets an immediate tax credit, but how much do they get to channel the funds to a specific project in the future? What are those restrictions?
So there actually are no restrictions, but there are also no requirements to distribute. So unlike a private foundation where there's a 5% annual requirement, the national average of distributions in a donor advised fund are significantly higher than the average in private foundations. They're basically a very flexible account type that allows a funder to take an upfront tax deduction. In some cases, they get a better tax deductibility rate than in a private foundation, depending on the assets that they're contributing. And then the onus of due diligence is actually on the administrator. So the funder requests a distribution, and the administrator actually makes sure that it's a qualified distribution and that everything's above board. But what most people don't realize is that you can actually do gifting, granting, and investing via DAF. It's not that common yet. A lot of the larger providers aren't doing it, but we have some partners that do it on a regular basis.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And excuse my ignorance, but can you sort of clarify for me the difference between what do you call the family offices or foundations versus a venture capital firm? As far as the mission or the drive.
Yeah, this has kind of shifted as of late, in part because of the amount of wealth creation that's concentrated in a small amount of families. But there are a lot of families now that are opting to go direct versus go through traditional venture capital channels. The challenge there is that it can be difficult to access, a broad landscape of opportunities. And if you do broadcast what you're looking for, you kind of get inundated. And so that's in part, a service that we provide for them. But the family office has multiple buckets of capital that they can tap into. They've got their private foundation and they've got their investment assets, and they have a general thesis around each, and they typically have a staff that would manage each one of those mandates. So as we get to know the family office, we understand what those requirements are, and our job is to go out and do a reverse inquiry to find opportunities that match that across the spectrum. But we deal with opportunities that are very early stage, pre-seed, that otherwise probably venture capitalists certainly wouldn't touch it, and all the way up to Series F companies that are pre-IPO that are looking for a more aligned investor. And by aligned, I mean with the impact objective of the entrepreneurs that started the company. That can be hard to find in the venture capital space.
That's true. Thank you so much. And, for Steve Suzuka, how can Research Park tenants explore partnership opportunities with universities from your perspective?
That's a great question. Yeah, so there are multiple opportunities and avenues, and I would imagine, knowing many of the research parks, that you're already doing these things. But here are a couple of examples. So for those university research parks, I would really encourage you to bring in the tech transfer office from your nearest institution, the one you're affiliated with, and even those would be outside the neighborhood, in and actually what they're working on. It's unbelievable what happens when you get smart people in the room together to identify areas of overlap. And as I mentioned earlier, those areas of overlap could be, hey, that's a technology that would greatly increase the productivity of a particular widget that I'm making. So maybe it's an in-license opportunity. But as I mentioned, it actually works both ways. It can also be a resource that you had no idea that existed on the huge university campus next to you, that is accessible to you. So again, back to a clean room that's very challenging to afford. It also works the other way. And having worked in the tech transfer office, we often worked with industries and companies in the area to help us get across that valley of death that Christian showed before. So as we mentioned, the level of risk for the university inventions might be high, and the rate of return might be low enough that a company's not interested in licensing it. Universities have no way to change the cost structure, but what we can do is eliminate the risk. And so we've worked with 3D prototyping shops to actually develop our products further. So that's another opportunity. Another one is recognizing that you have a wealth of education and talented personnel are there, including graduate students and internship opportunities, might be a possibility for your institution that would really be able to tie you in even closer with, say, a particular department you're interested in. So that's just a couple of areas of overlap.
Thank you so much. I had a couple come in for Steve Ferguson. So can you expand a little bit on the databases that the NIH has beyond the technologies to license? And are they available for free?
Sure. One of the databases I mentioned is on the grant side in terms of, it's called Reporter. And so what that shows is previous grants, both to academics and small business innovative research, and also our own internal projects. So that's a way to search to see what people are supposed to be working on, at least what's the, in terms of their projects or their funded things. And so that's, as I mentioned before, that's a very good way to sort of find maybe emerging technologies before they happen, because obviously once it's published in Science or Nature, you're probably not going to be the first in line, to talk about a collaboration or a license agreement. But maybe you want to go earlier, and so talk to people that are working in your area. Obviously, so that would be one thing, is to search that database for opportunities. The other thing obviously would be, this would also apply to universities, is make sure that you're keeping track of the scientific literature in your particular area, whether it's engineering, life sciences, and certainly the resources that at the National Library of Medicine, which is one of our institutes, but a very outward focusing institution, would be a very good source for that type of information, whether it's articles or or data or sequences of particular genetic material. And I think that's the other thing. And the other thing would be to look very carefully to see what repositories are operated by NIH. You know, basically, it could be related to animal models, HIV reagents. So if there's an area that you're working in that needs biological samples, often those are very difficult for small companies to replicate. And if you're really accelerating the technology, why are you inventing something that someone else already did? So check for repositories, either funded by the NIH or operated directly by NIH contractors in your area and kind of in your technical area, and see what's available. So I think by going through sort of paper resources, electronic resources, and also physical resources, you can make up a lot of ground and accelerate some of the projects that your organization are working on.
Thank you so much. And Steve, another one came in, to look at your perspective. There's a proposal that I understand that to expand the NSF funding by $100 billion to be more applied to applied research more away from the basic research. Is this a good policy to create more economic developments?
Well, I think it's going to be at the end of the day, it's going to be a focus of what Congress wants to do. I mean, we look at tech transfer, they're really focused on as economic development activities. So that it's really underpinning, we're in science agencies or engineering agencies, but really it's focused on economic development. So I think that's part of it. And also we have to look and see, you know, the SBIR program, STTR program has been expanded in recent years. So there's a greater set aside for those types of things. So clearly, at the end of the day, the public is interested in results. The Congress, as a funding agency for our programs, is very interested in results. So we have to keep that in mind. Now, whether that's what the balance is, that's a very difficult question. But we think we'll need both. But we have to keep in mind that while we're doing research, while we're either basic or applied, that at the end of the day, we need to transfer or translate it into the public. The taxpayer is really expecting to see products on the market, and they're not really a big, obviously reading the scientific literature. Something that impacts their healthcare, their well-being is what they really want for their tax dollars.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And actually, I'd like to pose that question to the whole panel because you guys have diverse sort of areas. So if I go to Paul next, what would your thoughts on the same NSF funding $100 billion transition?
I mean, one of the biggest tricks, of course, is what is it? Is it going to be new money? Is it going to take away from something? And that's always one of the biggest balance areas. So, you know, do you shift focus, or are they actually talking about actually providing additional funding in order to expand programs to address this really important area? So it's a really particularly important thing, as Steve mentioned. To do economic development has been the focus of a lot of the tech transfer legislation. We just want to make sure that we don't do that at the expense of taking away the research that underpins that development activity. And then you kind of start questioning, well, what do we get out of this? So as it's written at the moment, it looks like new funds, but we'll see. That's always a big balance within the Congress, and, you know, making sure we don't lose focus and sort of lose our way. As I said, you can do all sorts of development work on the downstream, which is really great, really important stuff, but you got to continue to feed that, or else you're going to dry up the big resource we're trying to exploit.
Thank you very much. Steve Silska, what do you think about that as well?
Yeah, so I think Steve and Paul said it both very well, and that is you need a balance of both basic research that will lead to inventions you weren't expecting, and then applied research that will advance those inventions even further. So it's really the balance between those two. As Steve rightly said, it's about making sure that you're maximizing federal dollars to creating societal impact. And that is what we all want at the end of the day. You want to be sure that you've got the basic research that leads to the developments downstream. It's striking that balance. And as Paul said, you know, it becomes a question of, is this new money in, or is this reduced, say, basic funding? And so it's the right things to be thinking about, especially when we're looking at a very challenging economic environment right now, and opportunities to create good, high-paying jobs is important.
Thank you very much, Steve. Christian, what's your thought on that as well? And how does it impact your area?
I would generally say it's pretty concerning to see this focus on more of a short term than a long term approach. I mean, we always advocate for kind of diversifying your funding portfolio and allocating, to basic research applied all the way through. But it's difficult for us to match researchers in the basic stage because they don't always know what the intended outcome is. And so if I have a funder that's interested in autism, it's difficult to figure out which researchers to match them with because the intended outcome may be something completely different, right? And so, we think it's incredibly important to continue to invest in basic research so that we have that pipeline of inventions that can take shape and have impacts in a number of different areas.
Thank you very much. And Christian, another question came up, and it's about opportunity zones. They were touted when it all came together as to help support real estate and operating businesses in distressed areas. And are the family offices and those investments interested in opportunity zones? In many cases, there are research parks that are developing within opportunity zones, but I'd love to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, it's come up a few times. Most of the family offices we deal with have already made their allocations, and they're a little bit unsure of how that's going to pan out going forward. It doesn't seem to have ever been a driver in an allocation, but it's certainly a plus. That if a company is in an opportunity zone, there's that's added benefit, but not a motivator.
Thank you very much. And Christian, actually, I had a question earlier that I missed. What are some of the funding structures that private families are using, and why and when should entrepreneurs consider private funding sources?
So there are a number of funding structures that are not that well known to private funders, and so that's one of the roles that we like to play is to show them how, and in partnership with institutions, you can have convertible grants, right? Where there can be a repayment structure on a grant that allows the institution to realize more value in an innovation, and then reapply those funds back into more research, and also allows for a funder to get a return, not necessarily with a multiple, but more as a yes, if this works out, this can be recycled, right? That's really attractive to funders when they're looking at a lot of different opportunities, and you have one that has this recoverable aspect to it that's attractive. So I think there's a lot of need to kind of think that through from institutions, to look at the funder's mindset and understanding you're competing with a number of other opportunities, and how do you sweeten the deal without giving away the farm, so to speak, right? But some of the other structures I mentioned, previously, program-related investments. These are investments that count towards a foundation's required 5% distribution. They're traditionally made because they're either below market rate or below market rate, return, or above market rate risk. But it's an opportunity for a foundation to take more shots, right? And to take a little risk using this mechanism to deploy capital and really see what happens. We're starting to see actually fund managers come out and appeal to this kind of new cross section of capital, right? So from a public good perspective, I'll give you one example. Family office that we're working with is actually kind of first money into a company that has commercialized, and they're meeting the program-related investment requirement by restricting the use of funds to research. So a new company gets an influx of capital. The requirement is to spend that on research, but that ultimately increases the value of the company, right? So as that happens, that's a plus for everybody else along the way. So that's another area that we help with. We're also looking at talking to both sides of the equation on how do you structure the capital with the risk and stage of the company, right? And kind of try to be the liaison between both sides to understand how to do that. And that can really happen across all stages. So hope that answers the question.
It did. Just for my clarification, can you expand a little bit on that 5%? Just to clarify, again, is that on the family foundations where there's an obligation? Is it tax-wise, or what's driving that?
Yes. So on a private foundation, the IRS requires that you distribute 5% of your assets, each year for your philanthropic mission. Mm-hmm. And so, understanding that foundations are required to invest along that mission, you can appeal to those foundations with a different structure other than a gift or a grant, right? There can be a return component. And one thing I didn't mention before either is there's also a mission-related investment or an MRI component that appeals to the other 95% of the corpus, where the IRS has come out with guidelines that said that encourage the board of a family foundation to make investments along the mission of the organization. In other words, they've loosened the fiduciary requirements of those foundations to make them a little bit more capable of making more investments along the mission that can be more return driven.
Thank you so much. I had a question for all four panelists, but foundations and federal government has been more flexible, obviously, late on agreements to address COVID-19. And can each of you give sort of examples from your perspectives about that flexibility on those agreements? And I guess we'll start with Steve Ferguson.
Sure. So one example comes to mind for at NIH, and that's respect to what we call emergency use MTA, emergency use material transfer agreement, which has its origin actually in before this current pandemic. But the idea being is that for certain situations, you want to reduce the time in terms of sharing materials. I think that the current example, the quickness that we've been able to actually put new products into clinical testing shows the value of accelerating the collaboration process and making sure that data information is shared. So whether it's materials that need to be shared or information to be shared about a particular sequence of an emerging pathogen, being able to get the information out into the general scientific community is very important. So this has been a real focus, and we've seen some of the results, at least early stages of results of this accelerated process by having probably the most rapid development of new vaccines and therapeutics who are already entering phase 2 trials in such a short period of time. So that's kind of where we're interested in as an agency, is that it's making sure that we don't really know which approach is going to work, but we need to get out there and try it and make sure that basic information to get these things kickstarted as quickly as possible can happen. So that's been the focus.
Thank you so much. And Paul, can you address it from the federal lab perspective?
Yeah, I think Steve said it really well, but one of the things you always have to think about from the federal lab perspective is that every laboratory is driven by mission. So it's the federal mission isn't really to make money. That's not the way our government works. I mean, it's your tax dollars that work. That's where the money comes from. So it's not a money-driven kind of a proposition. So there are royalties and things like that involved, but right now the mission is to get these technologies out there. And so that's going to drive the actions of those federal laboratories and you really focus everything. You can put any politician right now in front of a camera and they can tell you how they want to make sure they see these technologies flowing out. And frankly, that gets translated immediately down into action within the laboratories to go ahead and try to work with companies. As I said earlier, we're not going to make those things. We need to work with companies. We want to get these technologies out there.
Thank you very much. And Stephen?
Yeah, so I'll echo what Stephen and Paul said. The federal government has done a really good job on helping reduce roadblocks to getting these incredibly quick technologies out to market. What you're seeing now, and I'll take a slight aside, what you're seeing now is as universities are gearing up to have students on campus, now all of a sudden they're thinking, well, hey, we probably have to test. And hey, where are we going to test? We don't have perhaps testing services. I know of tech transfer offices that are being heavily involved in the development of these testing centers going forward. So I think that has been really important for the government to reduce those roadblocks to allow for these technologies or testing centers to be available in a safe and economical manner.
Thank you. And Christian, from the private sector, what's your impression about that, or how does it impact the investment strategies?
Well, from the funder side, it hasn't had much of an impact other than I think the ability for opportunities to develop much faster than they have before on the innovator side, researchers and entrepreneurs. A lot of the funders are interested in filling gaps and accelerating along the way, and so they've been very encouraged to see that the authorities have allowed that to happen in a faster way, but they're also wary of some of the downside to that, in that you can have things that are getting approved faster and with less scrutiny. That there's implications in terms of the validation of the technology at those stages. I think.
And sort of the risk. I mean, it's the risk on the return can amplify later on, I guess, is the
right.
That's great. Steve Szalinski, what about Autumn has new guidelines on licensing in the time of the pandemic. Can you talk about them?
Sure. Yeah. So on our website, we had recently put together some licensing guidelines during this pandemic that a number of institutions have signed on to, including large associations like AAU or APLU or NIST for that matter. As well as probably 80 plus institutions. So basically, those licensing guidelines are developed in order to address this pandemic as quickly as possible. So they really say effectively three things. So number one, COVID addressing. COVID technologies are the top priority right now going forward, and clearly you're seeing that. And I've mentioned that a couple times. Number two, in order to get those technologies out, if possible, the best mode is a non-exclusive royalty-free license to those technologies during the period of the pandemic. So let's just get that out now as quick as possible. And then the third is after the pandemic is over, then it reverts to a more traditional license to retain those incentives that have been absolutely critical in advancing technologies over the past decades. And then, the standard types of clauses that are absolutely critical for universities, things along the lines of reserving rights, so a researcher can publish, as Steve mentioned, it's that transmission of information is absolutely critical, as well as the retaining those rights for, say, teaching or research purposes.
Thank you so much, Steve. Paul, a question for you has come up, and I want to remind all the attendees, please be sure to post your questions in the Q&A or even in the chat, and we'll be sure to pass them along. We don't want to miss your questions. A question for you, Paul, that came up is, NIST led the effort to help federal labs become more integrated in communities. With the release of NIST Green Paper, can you summarize it and where will this go into effect?
Well, so that's an interesting one because, of course, some of these are things that I did before I moved out of NIST, but I would expect to see some action in a few different areas. There was a couple main pieces in there. So there was a legislative request, and to the best of my knowledge, that has moved along pretty far, but that requires literally an act of Congress. So don't look for anything that can be done by NIST or from the, most agencies. That actually takes congressional action. So some of those very basic things that are put in that green paper, it does take a change in the law, and even some of those things are going to be very, very difficult to do. And I'll give you a great example of that are things like entrepreneurship from federal laboratories, like you see from universities, gets into a very messy area of law. So there's that side. The other side of things actually gets into the regulatory areas and what can be done under regulation. So we talked about the Bayh-Dole Act earlier. I would expect that you will see something on that sooner rather than later. Exact timing I can't really say. But I would expect some action on that relatively soon. And if you think about the idea that there's an election coming up, of course, that drives federal scheduling. And so that's one of those reasons why it really needs to happen soon if you're going to see some of those. And that actually involves a lot of things that affect the way universities, other partners actually use intellectual property that come out of federal funding.
Do you mind explaining for those that don't know what the NIST Green Paper is? Can you explain a little bit about that or summarize?
Sure. Well, so over the last couple of years, starting actually in 2018, I guess it was, NIST actually did a pretty large, extensive information gathering exercise. Multiple requests for information, public meetings, all these things. Basically, what can we do in order to improve the landscape for federal tech transfer? How do we make it easier? What are your pain points? Produced a draft paper, again, went out for comment on that paper and got a bunch of comments back in terms of a series of basically findings to say, well, we looked at these things, these are the comments that we got, and this is some actions that could be taken. Again, regulatory, legislative type of action, some policy actions. And that actually was published last April. Well, not the last April. year before. So I kind of get mixed up in the years here, but it's a relatively recent thing. And actually, so like, as you just alluded to, a lot of these things are actually still cranking through the process and coming out at the other end in terms of what are the actual actions that are going to happen across the federal government.
Thank you very much, Paul. You know, I know there will be questions that come up later on, and I encourage anybody to email Vicki or Brian Darmody. We can always relay them to our panel. Guys, it's been an honor and a privilege to moderate your panel. Such a great panel, and the distinctive from the NIH to the national laboratories to the tech transfer and to the private side and philanthropic side. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to bringing you guys together again at one of the next conferences we have at AURP, if I can get you guys there. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting us.
Yes, thanks very much. It's been an honor.
Thank you.